see, a lot of people at the moment are talking about AI, and AI really doesn't bother me, but it does, but only in the context of like wider debates. So for instance, the wider debate that I think AI fits into is the fact that technology has moved far too fast, and we haven't worked out what to do with the technological advances that we've already made. We haven't stopped and had that occasionally difficult conversation with ourselves, which we need to do before we can move on and make other discoveries, because otherwise we're just setting ourselves up for a load of trouble. Things get more complicated, and the more complicated things get, the more complicated problems get, and the more difficult that they are to solve. So one example of this that I would posit would be the pill, for instance. So many years ago, for all of human history, women have not had control of their reproductive systems. And then, so if a woman got pregnant, it was kind of like, oh well, it's just for you to deal with, because they didn't have that control over it. And then suddenly the pill came out in the 1960s, and suddenly they had that ability to control it. So, and that's a massive thing. People would play it off, but I think it's a huge thing. So they then have that ability to take that control within themselves. And this happened like, what, 60, 70 years ago? And what we haven't done is we haven't looked at the huge power shift that changes, and we haven't taken the time to say, right, okay, so how it is that we deal with this is that we have a very difficult discussion about power dynamics in male-female relationships, because they've quite clearly changed. For the better, I would add, because it's balanced it out, but they have still changed, so the same rules no longer apply. But we haven't done that, so kind of like relationship morals, relationship ethics, they get messed up on that basis. You look at other things as well, like porn. Porn is a massive example, because people who are born today will see more naked people than everyone born before them in human history. The richest kings would not have access to the sort of beauty that we can find for the sake of typing a word into Google. You can see anything you want. We don't know how our psychology is wired to deal with that. It could be very well, the evidence is coming in now, and it does show that it's actually porn very psychologically damaging, like seriously, pack it in. But we don't know how it is that adapts, and so we need a really difficult discussion on our relationship with pornography. Same with drugs. Drugs have just become a normalised thing. Things like ecstasy, that came out in the 90s. We banned it, but we haven't had that discussion. And these are technological advances that have come on in leaps and bounds. Social media. We don't know we do know what social media does to the brain, and it ain't good. But nobody would have had access to social media 20 years ago. And only now are we actually starting to look at the problems that social media can cause, the impact that it has on our life, on our culture, on our society. And that is, again, that's something that we haven't yet done. And we're not having these discussions. We're just letting these technologies come out willy-nilly, letting people use and abuse them willy-nilly, and we're not having a discussion on the morals, on the ethics, on the hard work that needs to be done, not just by humans, to see how this sort of thing integrates into our lives, to see how we use this, instead of kind of like just opening it up and saying, right, okay, so the whole world can use this. I trust that people are going to be good with it. Because most people will be good with it, but there'll be a few that will be really bad with it. And so it's like, I think we're desperate to have these discussions about how technology has changed our lives before we move forward, before we start to use AI, before we start to embrace it. The other thing I would say about it is that AI is not intelligent. It's what we see as intelligent these days. And what we see as intelligent these days is not the ability to deduct, to critical factions and deductive reasoning, but it's just about how much someone can Google about a given subject and just regurgitate it. That's what we think intelligence is these days. I mean, that's not intelligence, that's just the way that we see it. So it's kind of like, so I don't actually class it as that. I also see that there's a very distinct barrier between the digital world and the real world, and I think that what we sometimes do is that we give information in the real world credence. We give information in the digital world like priority in terms of how accurate it is over something in the real world. There's a guy that was telling me about the Revolution of '68 when I was in France, and his telling of it was very different to how I read about it on Wikipedia, and it was kind of like I was almost questioning him rather than because I thought that the information online was far more accurate than his first-hand account of things. And that's the mad thing, you know. And that's exactly what AI is. That's exactly what AI does. Is it doesn't have that human ability. It doesn't inhabit the real world. It just takes what we've written about the real world and comes to conclusions on it. But it doesn't do that through the deductive reasoning. But yeah, I just think that when it comes to technology, whenever something new comes out, rather than just think, oh yeah, let's plow in on this, let's have a think about it first. Let's draw up some rules, some ground rules, some morals, so that we know what's right and what's wrong before we start to implement that. Because then we wouldn't be in a hot mess as we are in with some of the debates that we have today.